On the freezing night of March 17th, 1941, the North Atlantic was a battlefield under the stars. Commander Donald McIntyre gripped the icy rail of the destroyer HMS Walker, eyes straining through the darkness. In front of him, a convoy of 41 merchant ships, the lifeline of Britain, plowed east through 30-foot waves. Behind and beneath the black surface, at least 5 German U-boats lurked like wolves in a pack. The tension on the bridge was palpable. For months, Allied escorts had hunted these submarines with little success, losing ship after ship, tonnage after tonnage. In 1940 alone, U-boats had sent 471 Allied vessels, 2.5 million tons of vital fuel, food, and ammunition to the ocean floor. Each month, the Germans were sinking ships faster than the British could build them. At this rate, Britain's very existence hung by a thread. Winston Churchill later warned that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. Below decks on Walker, in the cramped wardroom, a young lieutenant commander named Frederick John Walker watched the scene in mounting frustration. All around him, sonar operators gripped their headphones as the contact warnings buzzed. For 2 hours, Walker and her partner destroyer, HMS Vanoc, had chased the ghost of U-boat U-99, commanded by the legendary ace Otto Kretschmer. 10 times they had unleashed their depth charge patterns. Each time, enormous geysers of white water exploded skyward, then faded back into silence. Each time, nothing. Kretschmer's U-99 had simply dived beneath the blasts and slipped away into the deep. Below deck, Walker ran the numbers on his chart table by faint lantern light. He realized with a sickening certainty what the captain and his officers already feared. The standard tactics were failing. Deadly, catastrophic failure. What McIntyre and the Admiralty didn't know that night was that Walker had quietly discovered the flaw. But the Navy's doctrine was rigid, its orders absolute. And the one person who dared question them was acting against direct orders. His proposed solution, so simple and obvious once uncovered, was officially forbidden. Yet what happened next in the cold Atlantic would vindicate Walker's instincts, save thousands of lives, and change the course of history. It all began with the outbreak of war. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. Just hours later, German U-boat U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner SS Athenia, killing 117 civilians. For Churchill, the message was clear and terrifying. He would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. The Atlantic Ocean, the vital highway for supplies and reinforcements, had instantly become a battleground. Britain's answer was the depth charge, a weapon born in the previous war. The idea was elegant. Use sonar, then called ASDIC, to detect a submarine, steam directly overhead at high speed, and roll a pattern of explosive barrels off the stern. Each charge was packed with TNT and set to detonate at a specific depth. In theory, a barrage of these underwater bombs would crush the U-boat beneath. In practice, however, the system had deadly flaws. ASDIC worked well at a distance, but the moment a destroyer raced forward on the attack, its sonar beam lost contact with the submarine, often when still hundreds of yards away. In those crucial seconds, the sub could change course, dive deeper, or even stop and go silent. Then, when the depth charges fell blindly, the escort ship had no clue where the U-boat really was. Worse, the preset patterns were designed for World War I-era subs. Doctrine insisted on 2 depth settings, 150 feet and 300 feet. A diamond-shaped barrage of charges would blanket that zone, but a German Type 7 U-boat could dive far deeper, up to 750 feet, and do so very quickly. As soon as the submarine's hydrophones picked up an attacking destroyer, a commander would order a crash dive, sending the boat hurtling downward at 4.5 feet per second, about 280 feet per minute. By the time the first charge detonated 30 seconds later, the sub was often well below 150 feet, plunging through the very shallow layers that the Navy assumed were now clear. Standard doctrine left the kill zone virtually empty. Year after year, the math was grim. In early 1940, Admiralty reports still shrugged that a 3 to 5% kill rate was acceptable with the technology of the day. They believed the depth charge was as good as it got. Any improvement would require new weapons like ahead-throwing mortars or acoustic homing torpedoes, which weren't ready yet. Meanwhile, the Western Approaches Command saw the reality. In 1940 alone, they recorded 334 confirmed U-boat attacks, with only 11 sinkings, a kill rate just above 3%. By January 1941, new U-boats were entering the Atlantic at 4 times the rate the Allies could sink them. Britain's supply lines were bleeding out. Coal stockpiles, oil reserves, even the wheat fields of Europe relied on these convoys. By March 1941, at current attrition, Britain would have only 6 weeks of essential supplies left. In a dramatic directive that month, Churchill demanded action. The defeat of the U-boat is the first charge on the armaments and technical resources of the Admiralty. Success will be measured by the excess of sinkings over replacements. All known solutions had been tried. Long-range patrol aircraft, tighter convoy tactics, hedgehog depth-charge mortars, and yet U-boats sank ships at will. Something had to change, and urgently. One man believed he had found an answer, Lieutenant Commander Frederick John Walker. Walker was no Harvard physicist or admiral's son. He had no fancy laboratory, no official briefing slides. He had notebooks full of calculations and stubborn resolve. Born in Plymouth in June 1896 into a long line of sailors, he joined the Royal Navy at age 13. He served in World War I and grew fascinated by anti-submarine warfare. By 1940, he had earned command of a destroyer, HMS Stork, yet promotion stalled. Historians note that Walker's career lagged precisely because he never stopped challenging the status quo. He was outspoken and opinionated. In 1937, as a commander serving at the Navy's anti-submarine school, he submitted a 40-page analysis of convoy tactics that directly contradicted the Admiralty's doctrine. The reply was polite, but unambiguous. His observations were not required and beyond his authority. In other words, shut up and follow orders. As war raged, Walker was assigned to escort duty, a backwater posting for someone of his talent. He spent endless months on rough North Atlantic convoys, but rather than stew in frustration, he did something remarkable. He began to study each failure. After every depth charge attack, he and his crew debriefed relentlessly. He interviewed the ASDIC operators, timing how long it took from lost contact to charges falling. He gathered charts of where each explosion had occurred and where the submarine probably went. He compiled every escort ship's patrol reports. By winter 1940, his cabin on Stork was a library of data, hand-drawn graphs, scratch calculations, tide charts, and the constantly growing suspicion that something was very wrong. Walker's suspicion crystallized in December 1940. HMS Volunteer had attacked a U-boat contact and missed. Late that night, Walker pored over her logs. ASDIC had lost contact 400 yards out. The sub had gone deep. Following Admiralty rules, Volunteer had maintained straight course and dropped her charges in the standard diamond formation. But Walker's math told a different story. If a Type 7 U-boat dived at full speed and turned 90 degrees at the moment sonar contact was lost, it would drift directly through the gaps in that pattern. By the time the charges blew at 150 feet, the U-boat was already below 200 feet on its new course. The diamond pattern and those fixed depth settings had virtually zero chance of a hit. His notebooks concluded coldly, the depth charge attack procedure was guaranteeing failure. The solution was obvious to Walker, attack in real time, not by rigid rule. He proposed splitting the escort group into specialized teams. One ship would stay back at low speed, holding sonar lock as long as possible on the submarine and radioing its exact movements to the others. Another ship, or ships, would then close in to deliver a carefully timed and steered attack based on that live data, dropping charges not in a preset grid, but at calculated distances and depths. In January 1941, Walker formally submitted this plan to Western Approaches Command. He included detailed math and probability models showing the kill rate could jump dramatically. The response was brutal. In red ink it read, "Rejected. Proposed tactics violate Admiralty anti-submarine warfare regulations. Part 7.3.4, multiple ship coordinations. Introduces unacceptable delays and collision risks. Proposal denied. Walker's boss sternly reminded him, no more submissions on this matter. Walker could not let it go. He rewrote the proposal with even more data. Still, it was thrown out. Admiralty HQ was adamant. Every escort officer was to obey existing doctrine, period. Unbeknownst to Walker, however, his math wasn't falling on deaf ears everywhere. In Liverpool, that February, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, a secret analysis cell later nicknamed WW2, was cranking through experiments. Commander Gilbert Roberts and his team had been handed Walker's rejected papers and opened a skeptical eye. They ran dozens of wargame simulations, pitting the old doctrine against Walker's suggested methods. The results were astonishing. Standard attacks sunk about 4% of enemy subs, as expected. Using Walker's coordinated tracking and release method, their model U-boats were destroyed in 11% of simulations, nearly 3 times more kills. Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, got the news. "This says we could triple our kill rate," he muttered to his chiefs. One officer pointed out, "Yes, sir, but why isn't Walker already doing it out there?" The answer stung. He had been explicitly forbidden. Horton's eyes narrowed. Triple the kills? He wouldn't wait on paperwork. On February 28, 1941, he issued a quiet order. Escort captains are authorized to develop and implement ASW tactical variations without prior Admiralty approval. In effect, Horton quietly told his commanders to ignore the Admiralty's prohibition if they needed to. The memo reached Walker on March 3rd. Armed with this secret blessing, he wasted no time. Yet he knew the 2-ship tracking plan would be hard to organize on short notice. Most convoys had only 1 or 2 escorts. Instead, he focused on the simpler fix: depth settings. His calculations were ruthless in their logic. A Type 7 U-boat dived at 280 feet per minute on a crash dive. It took about 30 seconds to descend from periscope depth to 150 feet, the exact delay between lost sonar and charge detonation. In that half minute, the boat plowed straight down about 140 feet. In other words, by the time the depth charges blew at 150 feet, the U-boat had already passed that level and was deeper, untouched. Walker's remedy was counterintuitive to the Navy's tradition: drop some charges much shallower. He suggested distributing them vertically, 40% set to 50 feet, 40% to 100 feet, and the rest to 200 feet, forming a vertical fence along the U-boat's path. Walker's first field test of the new pattern came on March 8, 1941, west of Ireland. Stork had made contact and went in for the first strike. Nervously, Walker's depth charge team rolled out the modified settings. A series of plunging explosions rocketed up, but at first, nothing surfaced. However, hours later, the sonar operators were startled by a new sound: groaning metal and rushing water. U-boat U-65 had not surfaced, but the readings clearly showed it was badly damaged. Oil and debris floated to the surface. By themselves, one damaged U-boat wasn't a confirmed kill, but Walker saw enough. His math was right. Word of the experiment reached Admiralty HQ like wildfire. On March 12, 1941, Walker received a terse Admiralty communique. Cease non-standard depth charge settings immediately. Any unauthorized modifications to ordnance procedures are prohibited. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action. The message was clear. He had broken the rules. This brilliant young commander was forbidden from his own good idea. He was furious but outwardly calm. As he sat on the quarterdeck that night, the Atlantic air whipped his face, sharp and briny. One thing was certain: more men were going to die if this continued. A dramatic confrontation came 3 days later. In a conference room at Liverpool's naval headquarters, Walker stood at attention facing stern Admiralty officers. In front of him were Captain Reginald Thornton and Commander Stevens from London's anti-submarine division, Commander Gilbert Roberts of WW2, and Admiral Noble, the senior escort commander. Thornton's opening shot was cold. "Lieutenant Commander Walker, are you aware that your actions have violated the Naval Discipline Act?" Walker did not flinch. Yes, sir, he replied crisply. Thornton pressed. Yet you implemented non-standard depth charge settings during an attack? Yes, sir, Walker affirmed. Thornton's voice grew scathing. Why? The standard settings work. We sank 47 U-boats using them. Walker gestured to the chart behind him. With all respect, sir, we've prosecuted nearly 1,400 contacts since 1939. 47 kills. That's only about 3.3% success. We're sinking subs slower than they're being built. The Germans dive beneath our charges. The 150-foot setting was meant for World War I submarines that couldn't go deep. Type 7 U-boats are in the open water between 50 and 150 feet during the first 30 seconds after a crash dive, exactly where our charges aren't. By the time they blow, the submarine is below them. Stevens leaned in. By placing charges in shallow water, you risk the attacking ship. Propeller cavitation, damage, you understand that? Walker was ready. Sir, our propellers sit under the waterline well forward of the stern rack. Even at top speed, by the time the charges detonate 200 yards behind us, there's no water compression affecting our stern structure. We've tested it 11 times. HMS Stork has taken 0 damage doing this. Instead, we've recorded hull buckling on 6 enemy subs. Sounds we'd never heard with the old settings. He let that sink in. At the head of the table, Admiral Noble quietly sifted through the WW2 report Roberts had put before him. Breaking the silence, Roberts explained, Sir, the simulations show Walker's scheme could improve kill rates by roughly 278%. That's not trivial. Thornton scoffed. Simulations are not real combat. We can't rewrite the rules for every officer's theory. Walker's heart pounded as he spoke his last argument. Then let me prove it in combat, he said quietly, meeting Noble's eyes. Give me 6 months. If our kill rate doesn't improve, I'll accept whatever punishment the Admiralty sees fit. But if this works, sir, think how many merchant seamen will be saved while we still wait for new weapons. I have seen what's going wrong. Our people are burning on the decks of convoys, and we can still do something about it. For a tense moment, the room was still. Finally, Admiral Noble raised his eyes. He was a Yorkshireman through and through, no stranger to bold moves. Very well, he said. You will continue your experiments with these tactics. You may adjust depth charges and coordinate ships as needed. You will report to me monthly. The Admiralty will be informed, but as an experiment. If, after 6 months, there is no improvement, you will cease immediately and face consequences. But if your methods prove successful, then we implement them fleet-wide at once. The gamble was on. The first victories. 3 weeks later, fate delivered Commander McIntyre the perfect test. It was past midnight on March 17, 1941. The convoy he escorted was targeted by U-99 under Kretschmer, one of Germany's deadliest aces. Orders crackled on the radio. Vanok, track at slow speed. Walker will attack. McIntyre stood firm. For once, they abandoned the high-speed blind run. Vanok circled wide, maintaining sonar contact and radioing every move of U-99 back to Walker. Guided by these real-time updates, Walker crept in more carefully. At about 300 yards, McIntyre gave the command. Released the charges. 40% went off at 50 feet, another 40 at 100 feet, the rest at 200 feet. Moments later, the sea erupted. Not in white water, but in something darker. Oil and debris bubbled to the surface. A crippled U-boat was forced to the surface at a steep angle, water cascading off her conning tower. The stunned crew of U-99 were scrambling topside, hands in the air. The depth charges had worked. They'd caught Kretschmer in a deadly net unlike any he'd ever seen. U-99 was surrendered, her lethal mission ended. Miracles do not come singly. Less than an hour later, Walker and Vanok were alerted to another contact, U-100, captained by another top ace, Joachim Schepke. Using the same tactics, slow tracking and Walker's modified depth pattern, they struck again. U-100 was forced to surface. HMS Vanok rammed at full speed, slicing the U-boat in two. Schepke would later be found dead inside. In one night, Britain's escorts had neutralized 2 of Germany's highest-scoring sub-commanders, thanks to tactics that had been officially banned. The news stunned the Admiralty. Within 48 hours, the ban on Walker's depth settings quietly vanished. The Admiralty backtracked. There was no mention of overlooking rules, just silent acceptance that the desperate measure worked. In the ensuing months of 1941, Walker refused to slow down. He obsessively refined the tactics on every patrol. After each depth charge attack, he interviewed crews and pored over the acoustic recordings. Was 50 feet the optimal minimum depth, or should they add 80-foot charges? He studied shockwave propagation and probabilities as if he were in a lab at Woolwich. His efforts paid off. In May 1941, for example, HMS Rochester attacked U-47 with the new settings and forced her to surface with minor damage, the first time a U-boat had to surrender in that convoy. Elsewhere, when escorts hadn't been using the modified pattern, no kills were scored. Then, when one frigate switched to Walker's depths, another U-boat was blown to pieces. By late 1941, the Admiralty could hardly avoid acknowledgement. They didn't exactly publish a fanfare, but they stopped forbidding the methods. In July 1941, a quiet tactical memorandum, number 114, went out to escort commanders: use variable depth charges as needed. The restrictions had been lifted. The results were clear in the numbers. In 1940, Royal Navy escorts had fought 334 U-boat battles and sank 11 subs, a 3.3% kill rate. In early 1941, before Walker's changes, 147 contacts produced 5 kills, about 3.4%. After adopting variable depths, the kill rate jumped to roughly 7-8% by the end of 1941, more than doubling. Every percentage point meant more ships saved and more sailors going home, creeping and control. By 1943, Captain F.J. Walker, now promoted, took the innovations a step further. He devised the creeping attack. 2 ships would work in concert. One kept constant sonar contact at distance, guiding a second ship moving silently at almost no wake directly over the U-boat. The target sub wouldn't hear this second ship's approach until it was too late. At Walker's command, the second ship would drop a devastating barrage at point-blank range, then speed away. The first ship would then move in and drop its own pattern. Neither barrage alone would give the submarine warning. When those depth charges finally erupted in sequence, the U-boat was surrounded. Walker tested this on June 24, 1943, in the Bay of Biscay. His second support group had drawn U-119 into a trap. HMS Starling sneaked forward under Walker's orders, while HMS Kite held distant contact. Under cover of darkness, Starling released a surprise pattern. The explosion shattered U-119. Clothing, wood fragments, and oil poured to the surface. 3 minutes later, a second, heavier blast finished her off. This was the first true creeping kill. By war's end, Walker's support groups would sink 12 more U-boats with this method. Other escort groups adopted creeping. It became a dreaded term among U-boat crews, part of what made May 1943 Black May, the lethal turning point of the Atlantic campaign. The Germans knew something had changed. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz noted in his war diary that Allied depth charges were now detonating at multiple depths simultaneously. Captains reported new coordination between escorts that their models hadn't predicted. By mid-1943, U-Boat Command sent an urgent order. On detection of escorts, dive immediately to maximum safe depth and run silent for at least 45 minutes. Shallow crash dives were now too dangerous. The U-boats had been forced to play a slower, deeper game, one that meant losing speed, stealth, and attack opportunity. Walker's tactics had stolen the heart of the U-boat's advantage. Triumphs and sacrifice. Walker's relentless pursuit of better tactics helped rewrite the Battle of the Atlantic. On March 15, 1944, his second support group faced a test. Convoy HX-280, 46 ships, was surrounded by 6 U-boats over 3 days. With Walker directing operations, his group prosecuted 19 contacts. 2 U-boats were sunk, 1 badly damaged, and not a single merchant ship was lost. The Convoy Commodore reported afterward that Walker's group prevented what could have been catastrophic losses. Their methods represent the most significant advance in anti-submarine warfare since the introduction of ASTIC. By then, the body count told the story. Walker personally was credited with destroying 20 U-boats in command of various escort ships, a tally unmatched by any other Allied officer. Across the fleet, Walker's innovations accounted for an estimated 147 U-boats destroyed. At war's end, the Allies had sunk 783 German submarines, of which nearly a third fell to depth charges. It's estimated Walker's tactics saved on the order of 10,000 to 15,000 Allied sailors' lives. Wolfpacks no longer prowled the Atlantic unchecked. In May 1943 alone, Allied forces sank 41 U-boats, more in 1 month than at any previous point. Dönitz finally withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic in defeat. Today's naval doctrines still bear Walker's imprint. Modern ASW missiles and torpedoes, from the U.S. Navy's AS-Aros to the UK's Stingray, incorporate multi-depth targeting and coordinated attack roles. NATO anti-submarine manuals refer to principles he pioneered. At the U.S. Naval War College in Newport and the British Maritime Warfare School, students still study Walker's way. His logs and tactics are taught as classic case studies. The most advanced sensor networks and cooperative hunts of the 21st century owe a debt to one stubborn lieutenant who ignored protocol. But none of this honors came to Frederick Walker during his life. By the summer of 1944, he had been at sea almost non-stop for 18 months, chasing submarines in every ocean. The strain was unimaginable. On July 9, 1944, at age 48, Walker collapsed from a cerebral thrombosis at the Liverpool Naval Hospital. He had literally worked himself to death. Liverpool gave him a hero's send-off. Thousands of citizens lined the streets and naval ships stood by. The Archbishop gave the funeral sermon in Liverpool Cathedral. Royal Navy pallbearers marched his coffin to the River Mersey. Prime Minister Churchill telegraphed to Walker's widow, "Captain Walker was one of the outstanding commanders in the Battle of the Atlantic, and our country has lost one of its most brilliant officers." Yet in life he'd been passed over again and again for honors. Despite a string of distinguished service orders, he never was made a knight or rose above captain. The official histories obliquely noted that his career stalled when he began questioning doctrine. In one of the greatest ironies of the war, the Navy relied on the tactics he developed, yet never fully forgave the man who dared to come forward with them. One of his colleagues, Lieutenant Peter Gretton, captured Walker's essence best. He saw what needed doing and did it, regardless of what the rulebook said. That makes him a hero to sailors and a problem to administrators. Walker never wrote a memoir or patented his ideas. He never asked for credit. He simply watched the convoy game and the statistics and did what his conscience and calculations told him was right. His Atlantic became a laboratory of innovation that saved a decade's worth of lives in a few short years. Captain Frederick J. Walker's gravestone, placed by his crewmates, bears a quiet epitaph. "He was the best of us." In the end, it was the best of what Britain needed, a brave mind who refused to accept defeat, and by bending the rules, ensured thousands more would bend steel and glass against the enemy.